I think you can get started now. Karen, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome to today's session of the Pearson Center Conference on the new challenges for the Canada we want. My name is Karen Mock. Many of you know me as a human rights advocate, but I am also very pleased to be a board member of the Pearson Center and proud to have served since its inception. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Center is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. Although I am not at our headquarters at the moment, I am also speaking to you from traditional Algonquin territory. We welcome our speakers and audience who are joining us from across Turtle Island and beyond. As you may know, the Pearson Center is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging economic and social issues of the day. The Pearson Center for Progressive Policy is the only multi-partisan think tank which regularly engages representatives from all 5 federal parties, along with top business, labor, and civil society leaders and many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all our donors and sponsors. We are especially grateful to our sustaining sponsors who are Canada's Building Trade Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and AMEPSIO, Ontario's professional employees. And thank you, of course, to our special sponsors for this conference, Baylis Medical, the Hill Times, and the Canadian Health Coalition. Just briefly on the format, we have an hour-long conversation where the moderator will engage us in a discussion with our special guests for about 40 minutes. We will then take questions from you, the audience, so please send in your questions in the question box, and we will get to as many questions as possible. Pearson's President Andrew Cardozo will join us to help us facilitate the questions you send in. And a very special shout out to Andrew for his vision and tenacity in the founding and leading of the Pearson Institute. We will end at approximately 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Our webinar today is titled Democracy in Danger. It is a timely topic indeed. April 27th is Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah. It is said that it was the deliberate exploitation of democracy at its weakest link that resulted in the Nazi rise to power and Hitler's being appointed chancellor. Within 3 months of that election, democracy had ceased in Germany. As Peter Biro wrote in the introduction of his recent edited book, Constitutional Democracy Under Stress, A Time for Heroic Citizenship, and I quote, "Democratic backsliding is occurring at a furious pace. The causes are many and the reasons are complex, but one thing is certain, without the heroic engagement of enlightened, principled, courageous, and grateful citizens, liberal democracy's grand promise of freedom, equality, and justice will remain unrealized ideals." And we have 3 eminent experts in the field to enlighten us today. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. The Honorable Eleni Bakopanos is a former MP, Privy Council member, and public policy advisor. She is the author of Political Recruiting and Women in the Political Process. She is the past chair and on the executive of the National Board of Equal Voice, as well as a founding member and co-chair of the Quebec chapter of Equal Voice, à Voix Égale, a national multi-partisan organization whose mission is to promote more women to elected office. She has received numerous awards in recognition of her contribution, both in Canada and internationally. Mayor Guy Caron, His Honor, is a former journalist, politician, and currently the recently elected mayor of Rimouski. Congratulations, Guy. He was elected the mayor in the 2021 Quebec municipal election. He was previously a member of the House of Commons of Canada from 2011 to 2019 and served as the federal House leader of the New Democratic Party from 2017 to 2019, substituting for party leader who during this time did not hold a seat. He is the author of Crossing a Line, a citizen's inquiry on Canada-US relations. And I must add just a little PS to his brief bio. I can't resist telling you that Guy and I worked together at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation 20 years ago when I was the CEO and Guy a valued member of our communications team. Great to see you, Guy. David Coletto is founding partner and CEO of Abacus Data, who has more than a decade of experience working in the marketing research industry. He is a leader in online research methodologies, public affairs research, corporate and organizational reputation studies, and youth research. David is an outspoken proponent of transparency in the polling industry and is regularly called upon by media and organizations to provide expert analysis of public opinion and research methodologies. Our moderator today is Frank Bayliss, joining us today from London, England. David is executive chairman of Bayliss Medical Company and a former member of Parliament himself, where he worked to improve the democratic process of the House. Thank you all for contributing to this important discussion today. With that, over to you, Frank.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate your kind words and welcome everybody. We'll jump right into it because this is a very big topic. And I'd like to start off with getting from you, Eleni, then Guy, the perspectives that you have from when you first started in politics to seeing, and Eleni, you have a tremendous history there. From when you first started to today, have you seen a change, a polarization or not, that we're hearing about? And what has been your perspective? And then I'd like to speak after you two. I'd like to hear from you, David. Do the Canadians see anything or not? But let's start with you, Eleni, please.
Certainly, I've seen a change, but that doesn't mean that in my time, and in my time, don't forget, was the time that we had the Reform Party, the Alliance Party, the Conservative Party. So there was a polarization. But once there was the union of those three parties into the Conservative Party, I thought that would take care of some of the polarization. But what I've seen over the years, Frank, is that in fact, it has gotten worse. If we take the example of some of the leadership candidates now running for the Conservative Party and some of the issues that they're bringing forth, especially their support of the so-called Freedom Convoy, which was an extreme element, I think, in Canadian society in terms of what they were asking. In fact, asking that the government be taken down by the Governor General, which was a lack of understanding of our Constitution. So I have seen more polarization. And if we're going to go back to what factor, I think, or one of the factors, I think social media has played a big role in terms of assuring that we get the extreme right, the extreme left, and the that people can actually anonymously put out all sorts of issues which are either fake news, misinformation, even lies, I'd say, right out lies out there, and that people would be liking and sharing that type of misrepresentation of the politician, of Parliament itself, of our Constitution. That has led to even a greater amount of polarization. And a good example, of course, is what happened in the United States with Trump, okay? That he was able to get himself elected using social media. Thank God they finally, Twitter decided that they weren't going to allow him to continue to use that platform, although now that Elon Musk has bought it, I'm not so sure he won't allow him back in. But that's my comment on that. But there was polarization, but I think if I was to add one other element, Frank, that I found different in my time, we were able to reach across party lines. I was able to go, let's say, to my colleague from the Conservative Party at that time, was Jean Charest, just to give an example, or even somebody from the NDP, and discuss the issues. I chaired the Immigration Committee in my first mandate, and I was able to put a unanimous report to the House of Commons only because I was able to sit down with my other colleagues. There was a little more freedom in terms of having those discussions. I think now there's more control in how much there can be discussion across party lines, which I found deplorable, because I think that leads to good debate, that leads to better legislation when you're able to have that discussion. Doesn't mean those discussions aren't taking place behind the scenes. And Frank, you would be in a better position to answer that, or Guy, because I was 20 years ago, don't forget. I mean, I was elected in 1993 and I lost in 2006. So it's been a while, but having been an observer for a long, long time also, and also looking at the fact that women are having a harder time, if I may say that, in terms of actually deciding to stay once they're elected. We've had a number of examples where younger members of parliament, female, have felt that the atmosphere was so toxic that they were unable to continue their mandate. That's very frightening when you're trying to have a parliament that is more open to diversity and inclusion. And I think I'll stop there for Frank, because I could go on, as you know.
No, we'll come back to that. You touched on a lot of good points that we'll swing back to, Eleni. Thank you. Guy, je te passe la parole. Et entre-temps, je veux juste dire to our audience, if you have questions, you can put them in at the end of the session. We'll be having questions. Et si vous avez des questions en français, gênez-vous pas. Tout le monde pourra les répondre en français aussi. So with that, Guy, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Frank. I would concur with much of what Eleni said. What I can add is, I think one mitigating factor to the polarization in Canada is the fact that we have more than two viable parties. In the US, they have two parties, so it's much easier to polarize around two entities than there is around 4, 5, or 6 like we have now. So it doesn't mean that it won't happen. Doesn't mean that it's not progressing. It's just progressing less fast than it would be in a two-party system. That being said, what we're witnessing in Canada is in large part what has been witnessed not long ago in the US. And I think this polarization is actually true. It's actually feeding off a variety of elements, including the sense of powerlessness from the population, a sense of losing control over one's life, which has been amplified, of course, by COVID and all of the measures that were necessary to minimize the impact of the pandemic. But that created really fertile ground for populism, extreme populism, I would say, take hold and to translate itself, and we're seeing it, as Eleni said, in the current conservative race, into elements that are actually a threat to the institutions that are the pillars of democracy. When I hear, and I'm an economist, I was on the finance committee, I sat on the foreign affairs committee with Frank, as well when I was there. When I'm looking at using the Bank of Canada as a scapegoat for everything that's happening, not that it's perfect, but it's essential to the financial stability of Canada and of those who are attacking the Bank of Canada right now. I think that's problematic, and I know that one of the candidates, Mr. Poilievre, not to mention him, when he was a minister, actually tried to downgrade, try to minimize the impact of Elections Canada in trying to bring people to vote and to participate in the electoral process. So that's called trying to attack the institutions, and you do it through the populism, where you're trying to, instead of really trying to use the institutions to better the reality of Canadians, you're actually telling Canadians that it's the fault of institutions if they are powerless. So to me, that's really problematic, and it's a threat for the future. And I'll just conclude by saying we'll talk about the global element of populism, but Frank and I, the last study that we did in the Foreign Affairs Committee before the end of 2019 was about the threat to liberal democracy. And back in 2019, I knew that it was affecting Europe, but I didn't know it was so close to Canada.
That's an excellent point, Guy. Merci. We've just heard from two, what we can say, very knowledgeable people that are part of the government. Now, David, I'd like to do what we see as parliamentarians or ex-parliamentarians. Is this what Canadians see and feel? Do they see a centralization? Do they feel it? Do they see a polarization? Do you see it, first of all, in your polls? And if they do see it, do they even care? Or I'd like to get, if you can give us that perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Frank, and great to be here. Thanks for everyone for tuning in. I think, when Eleni and Guy speak, you really do get a sense, and this is what I think the public sees, is, at least in Canada right now, the polarization is happening much more at the official, or what I'll call elite level. So, members of parliament, party leaders, party officials, who I think have become more polarized, right? That Eleni describes the lack of friendship across the aisle that might have existed decades ago is maybe harder today. It doesn't mean there aren't, but it's maybe harder to achieve. When we, as social researchers, pollsters, try to measure polarization, I mean, for the last number of years, we've looked to the United States and see data coming out from there that suggests, not only do people dislike the other party, and they say that they support, but they don't even want their kids to marry, supporters of that other party that they would support, right? It's gotten that far. We don't see a lot of evidence of that in Canada yet. And I think Guy raises a good point that our multi-party system makes it hard to, clearly define people. During the convoy and the occupation in Ottawa and elsewhere earlier this year, I asked some questions on a survey, and I asked people to, on a scale from 0 to 10, do you like or dislike, the Liberal Party of Canada, the New Democratic Party, the Conservative Party? And then I tried to look at what percentage of people like a lot one party and dislike another party a lot, right? And let's just use the Liberal Conservative dichotomy for a minute. A third of Canadians fall into that, what I would call polarized group, who say, I love you and I hate you, right? Now that's a lot of Canadians, but it's not everybody. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that I think a lot of the public simply responds to the politics they're given, and how they're feeling drives that. So it's a chicken and egg problem. So, what causes what is really hard to unpack. But I think of politics in a way as like a menu going into a restaurant, and you can only order what's on that menu. And if that menu is highly polarizing and not very appealing and fighting with each other, you either will pick the side that you're really excited about, or you might simply tune out and not eat and walk out that restaurant.
David,
so I think that's
on that point, we see a disengagement from young people. Could that be part of it? What you just talked about there, like not seeing what you're looking for on the menu.
I think so. I mean, for a long time, I think, if any Canadians are tuning into what happens in federal politics and provincial politics, and they, I think thankfully not everybody watches Question Period, right? Or very few people do, because if they did, they'd be turned off even more often, right? Because it doesn't really reflect the things people are looking for, which is, life is not a game, right? My inability to buy a home, my inability to get my kid into childcare, or find a good place for my aging parent to find care is not a game, but politics sometimes comes off as that. And in a polarized system, it seems even less relevant. So I do think we've seen a polarization in Canadian politics, not to the extent we've seen maybe in some European countries or in the United States for sure. But over time, the longer that goes on, I do think the more polarized the public will get, because then their identities and their willingness not to even talk to their friends or neighbors that they disagree with becomes more real. And I think the pandemic really did that, right? The debate about vaccines, as much as the vast majority of Canadians fully embraced and supported vaccinations, you did see, we saw evidence in our data of people saying, I've lost friends, I have become estranged from family members because of disagreements about that issue. And so that was something very specific, but it became politicized. And I think the election at the time of this happening contributed to that. So I don't think we're deeply polarized as a country, but I see elements of it that we should be worried that if we continue down this path, and we sometimes look to the United States and say, well, that's not us. We'll never get there. We're immune to that disease. I think complacency is the biggest mistake that we can make.
Do you think that there is an element of mistrust? Because I think trust is the thing that keeps people, that makes people value institutions. So when you lose that trust, and I think the pandemic and the example you used, David, about the vaccines is a perfect example where people lost trust in the healthcare system, right? And we always thought we had a really good healthcare system. The pandemic, although I think we did well, personally, that is not what the common citizen thinks. They think that the governments handled it wrong, that the health professionals got it wrong, that people were being given vaccines that hadn't gone through the proper, testing. So that trust, which I think was beginning to lack anyway before, is now compounded because of the pandemic.
I totally agree. I think trust is the basis for just how our society works. And if you think about it from politics, right, we know from research we've done and academic work that our civic literacy level in Canada is very low. So when Guy talks about the Bank of Canada, right, and how the candidates are undermining its credibility, we also have to remember most people have no idea what the Bank of Canada does. So
that's true.
In essence, if I don't trust that institution and I don't have much familiarity with it, it's going to be very easy for me to then not see relevance there, right? So I do think in a society where civic literacy is low, general engagement in politics is low, and now trust is low, that is ripe for polarization.
Absolutely.
And this whole question we're asking today, which is, the decline of democracy.
What David is saying is actually very important because it goes to a weakness of the progressive side. The various degrees of the progressive side in politics has been very bad at connecting with people to tell them what, like, we're seeing the institution of Parliament as an institution. Yes, we know what it does because we've been there. We know how it works because we've been there. But for most people, they know nothing about it. So that ignorance, which is largely due, I would say, to the weakness of civic educations in school in all provinces, leads to the possibility of exploiting that ignorance, that lack of knowledge, for uses that increases that polarization. I'm looking, it goes far back in the US. Once again, it's like Reagan was able to attract all those blue-collar workers who used to vote Democratic all the time before, because he was able to make them feel like he was one of them, that he was against the system, a system that back in the 70s was really not serving them. And we've seen that with Trump as well, where most people who used to be together with the union movement, with the NDP in large part, with the Liberals as well, because they felt that we were defending them, they felt that we were on their side, well, they started switching to Trump. And here we have seen it for a certain number of years, that they were ready to listen to what conservatives were doing, even though conservatives were implementing measures to impede the work of unions, the ability of giving yourself a better standard of living. So all of that, I think it speaks to exploiting the ripe terrain for polarization, but we have some blame to take into this because we haven't been able to connect on the progressive side the way that we should have to keep the trust of those who benefit from that system.
But that's
now,
because we're fighting social media platforms. Sorry, Frank. I mean, we're fighting. Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead, Frank. I was just going to say social media platforms have exaggerated this anger, and I'll call it anger because that's what I see now, a lack of trust and a lot of anger out there. And it's become the type of solvent, the platforms, in terms of diluting what would have been institutions that should be strong, because we can say the tool can be an educational tool also. I mean, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, I can give you a whole bunch of other hashtags that began with Twitter or Facebook that were very effective in terms of passing the message. Somehow, we haven't been able to use that platform in a more positive way in terms of, because there is a lack of civil education, we haven't been able to use those platforms to educate, because I think that's where the young generation is at. They're not, reading, they're not listening to the news, and they're actually on those platforms. And those platforms are full of trolls who are out there to, to disinform, if I can use that word, and even go farther, harassment, sexism, misogynism, racism, discrimination that is out there, and it's not being controlled. There is no control over those platforms. And I think that is one factor that has led to the deterioration of our democracy. Sorry, Frank, I just wanted to make sure that we link it up.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, it's all like that. I'm going to add to that and ask another question then about scapegoating, finding someone to blame for our problems, which is always a dangerous thing that we see. If you're seeing some of that, and tie that into something you touched on, Eleni, which was the convoy that took place. And we're seeing some people, I think Guy touched on that, trying to talk to those extreme elements. Not to say that all members that had concerns about vaccinations are not extreme. I don't want to say that. But that polarization we talked about, is there scapegoating? And David, you can speak about this too. Are some parties trying to reach out to those, utilize that polarization or scapegoating to their benefit? Maybe we'll start with you, David, and swing through the three of them. Are you seeing some of that?
Well, again, more on my political scientist hat. I think there's always been scapegoating. So I don't think it's a relatively new thing. Tommy Douglas was railing against, bank and rail monopolies, when he became premier in Saskatchewan and beyond. So and conservatives have for long, and liberals, everyone finds a villain. That's the nature of politics, right? It's most effective when you can point people to something or someone or a group or an organization that is causing the problem that is angering them or upsetting them or causing them friction. But I think the point that you're raising, Frank, is it's seemingly endless, and the constant search for the villain means the trust that we might have with any organization starts to deteriorate, and we actually don't focus on the solutions, right? So you often hear from the most populist politicians, let's say, both sometimes on the left but also on the right, an endless stream of who's to blame without much solutions. And I think that just contributes to the public's alienation from the system, because they get excited, they get attracted to that message, but nothing really changes at the end of the day. And so that's the real risk in that. And I think Convoy or the occupation was an example of that people, even if they weren't out there, blockading my city and preventing, my team members and others from just living their basic lives, we're blaming Mr. Trudeau and the government for what they felt were overly restrictive restrictions on their lives. But it was deeper than that they just felt disconnected. And so it goes back to what Guy was saying about economic anxiety and alienation that then needs somebody to blame. And I think it's deeper than just that. But the convoy was, I think, the first expression of that we've seen in Canada for quite some time, that reminded us that we're, again, not immune to what might happen in other parts of the world.
Don't you think it was also connected to the fact of what happened in the US when Congress was stormed? That emboldened certain people to use that as one of the factors for doing the same thing in Canada. And this is where, the rapidity with which we get the media now through these platforms also allows people to connect and share the same thoughts, the same ideals, the same values, and emboldened then to do the same thing, because I think the two are connected. Personally, I think whatever happens internationally, if we can talk about that too, does end up, because of the social media being now open to everyone, that people use the same type of examples, maybe not exactly storming Parliament Hill. I considered it storming Parliament Hill personally. Okay, and so I think there was a connection, and the more we see examples of those elsewhere, the more they will be brought home, because we have not been able as politicians, I think, to somehow reach deep in this anger that people are feeling about the system not responding to their needs.
That's a good point, and actually I fully agree, and I fully agree with what David said. I'll go back to the point that you brought at the beginning, Eleni, to talk about social media, because we have a situation right now, and we talked about the helplessness, the alienation that people are feeling, but then you have some people who are feeding that, and it looks to me to be very an organized system. I'll just take one example of Twitter. We all heard of those troll farms who are basically writing from outside the country and basically creating false accounts where they can use and they can basically stimulate that anger and that frustration. But we were seeing many of those accounts which were on the side of the convoy and saying, we support you and we're with you, and basically helping with the logistics of what we've seen. And 3 weeks after, or maybe even 2 weeks after it ended, they started relaying pro-Russian, anti-Ukraine messages. And I cannot believe that people who were part of the convoy, for those who were there for the reasons that they felt abandoned by the federal government and they wanted to protest in some form, actually had such deep feelings about what was going on in Russia. But those feelings were stimulated, were exacerbated by social media. So social media is actually playing a very central role in the polarization. And I'm not talking about just being able to put any comments out there from regular people. It's being used as a weapon.
Oh, the trolls that are out there in any political campaign, in any election, and people are just, I mean, David can answer that better than I, since you have the data, and I think data is important also when we're talking about these factors, that people are just reading something on their social media and say, like or share. The rapidity with which you share the misinformation is mind-boggling when you think about what the consequences of the sharing. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. We need more control. There are ways to allow for freedom of speech, but at the same time have some control. For example, everyone who is on those social platforms should be verified, maybe by a third party, maybe not by Twitter, maybe not by Facebook, but a third party to verify, is this a person, even if they want to remain anonymous. I have no problem with that, because we have to believe in freedom of speech. Otherwise, we will not have proper debate in the country. But maybe they could be verified. Maybe they could verify the country, because you raised a point, Guy. Are there Canadians doing this, or is there some, I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but it's been proven. There was an article written recently in the New York Times, in fact, that proved that the Russians had a lot to do with what happened in the election of Trump. This is fact. This is not, it's been documented that they actually influenced people to vote for Trump. They were on those social platforms and were influencing people. That's a scary scenario when you think about some of the autocrats and dictators out there who are actually going to influence perhaps our next election, or who can even come into your iPhone and iPad without you knowing. By the way, there was a recent another article written in the New York Times by a journalist in the New Yorker, actually not the New York Times, the New Yorker, who talked about some of the systems like Pegasus and others that can actually come into your computer and your iPad and actually invade your privacy without you knowing it.
Frank, if I might just add here. So
go ahead, please, Dave.
2 points. One is we just did a survey. My colleague Richard Jenkins, who's on my team, came up with this, question: is there such a thing as truth? And we asked Canadians, and 1 out of 5 said there's no such thing as absolute truth or objective truth, which is scary high number. Number 2 is 17% of Canadians said it's okay to share content that's you're not sure is true, right? So that suggests to me that even if it's only a small minority, that could have a big impact, right? Because 17% of Canadians are millions of people, right? Millions of people sharing things that may not actually be true. However, I'm one who completely agrees with Eleni and Guy on the threats that social media currently have and have had on democracy. On the other hand, I can't imagine these, technology more broadly having such an impact on actually democratizing our world, right? I look really young, but I'm old enough to remember a time where if I had a disagreement with somebody about some basic fact, say the distance from, Earth to the moon, right? Think pre-internet. How would you confirm that? Well, you may have an encyclopedia, in my case on my mom's bookshelf, or you might have to call up an astronomer and, find an expert who can tell you. But you couldn't instantly verify information. You couldn't challenge authority. And so what technology has actually done in a positive way, which is when we're thinking about regulating it or managing the system, we can't lose fact of we now live in a world where voters, we're citizens, we're workers, where consumers have never been as powerful as they are in able to hold people in power accountable. So we need to find a way to balance both of those, right? Is that the threat that social media has on our democracy can't undermine, I think, the democratization that it's enabled people to actually, sometimes most of the time, Guy, if you get tweeted at, I hope it's positive. It's not always, I know, and a lot of it's vitriol.
No, it isn't.
Ability for your residents in your town, in your city, is really important to them, right? And you're sharing content on there. It gives us insight into you and what you're thinking in a way that, Eleni, when you were first elected, didn't really exist. Right? That ability to connect with your constituents.
Well, my constituents used to call and say obscenities and hang up. That is what they did do in 1993.
It didn't happen anonymously.
No, it did happen anonymously sometimes, but I could obviously touch them. I have to say, though, David, maybe it has to do, I love your optimism, okay? And I want to be optimistic about this. But if I take examples like Catherine McKinnon, or I take examples of other women, and I'll stick to the women, which is an area that I know best, when you have the Interparliamentary Union doing studies, and this is representatives of all parliamentarians all over the world, saying that 80% of female parliamentarians have been harassed on social media. 80%, look at the number. I mean, there was sexism, there was misogynism. I lived it in a different way, okay? It was more face-to-face. Now it's anonymous. And I want to go that I agree we're not going to go back to what it was in my time. That those platforms are there to stay. Artificial intelligence is coming now, which will also tell us what we think, how we do it. Algorithms tell us what we like, what we could share. But if we do not have controls, in terms of the trolls or where this information is coming from and how it's being used, and that's what I'm advocating for. I don't have a problem with free speech, and I think that's not the issue. Okay, and we'll see, as I said earlier, what Elon Musk, who just bought Twitter, will do with what he calls the lack of freedom of speech on Twitter.
Let's use that. Yeah, I want to use that point there, Eleni. That's a great point. And you talked also about, because we're running, it's so fascinating, but we're going to run out of time before we get a little bit international. And I do think, obviously, we're not an island. We are a turtle island, I get that, but we're not an island in the sense that Canada is part of the phenomenon going around the world. So that talks about centralization. And we're seeing one man centralizing power if he's able to get a hold of Twitter, to centralize it, quite frankly, in his hands. So I'd like to hear your thoughts from all three of you on centralization that's happening around the world and its impact on democracy, and also what centralizations are happening within Canada. We'll start with you, Guy, and then go through. Go ahead, Guy.
Well, I'll start here in Canada, actually, because we've seen, I think one of the reasons why our democracy has been weakening to the point where it's vulnerable to the pressures that we're talking about is dating back 50, 60 years ago. And I would say it's probably back in the 70s when the executive power in Canada started to weaken the parliamentary power. We've seen strong party leaders starting, I'm sorry to say, but with Pierre Trudeau, but anyone after that hasn't been much better. to try to say basically it's the executive that leads and you are nothing outside of the Parliament Hill. I think that was Mr. Trudeau said that back in the 70s. You're a no-name outside of Parliament Hill, so you're going to say and do what I want you to do on behalf of the party, and that started putting power in the hands of the executive, and more it came that way. And I'd say my biggest disappointment as being an MP has been I'll say that the most important part of Parliament in my mind is the committee work, because that's where you go into the meat of the matter. This is where you go when you say God or the devil is in the details. This is where you see that happening. Prior to, let's say, the 2010, committees were more independent. The role that you have in committees is basically to keep government accountable, regardless of the party you're in. It's the only place in Parliament where you can call each other by our names. In the House, you call yourself by the riding you run. And you call yourself by your name because the party, the riding doesn't matter anymore. You are there to keep government in account. And it's been, once again, weakened to a point where it becomes an extension of the battle of the House of Commons. So if we don't really have anything to prevent polarization, we're going to basically see an exaggeration of it, or we're going to give it a way to expand even more. So we're seeing that in Canada. And we have a democratic system where people can actually have a say and have a vote. And in other countries, and once again, I refer to the study, that was really, to me, the most interesting thing, one of the most interesting things I've seen on the Hill, which was the threat to liberal democracies, the study we've done. It was mostly focused on Europe. We were talking about Hungary, Poland at the time, basically the rise of authoritarian regimes across Europe, and obviously we talk about Russia. That's when you have a weak democratic system, a weak constitution, a way for strong men, because it's usually men taking that much power. It's very hard to resist. We've seen it in the 30s, and I don't want necessarily to compare like what we're seeing here, but I mean that can foster the conditions to lead to a rise of fascism in the traditional conventional meaning of the term. So what we're seeing outside is threatening, but we have seen it here, and we have created the conditions for that to happen here in Canada.
I do think
Excellent
that there
point,
is
Steve.
room, but I do think, Guy, there is room to do better. For example, yes, there is some control, but there are some levers that parliamentarians have if they choose to use them, by the way. Okay, for example, I think there should be more free votes in the House of Commons. Obviously, you're not going to have a free vote on a budget issue. There's a reason for that, especially in a minority government. And I think the new dynamic in terms of the NDP and Liberals has really created a new paradox, eh? And we haven't even touched on that today, and we could have a whole session on that alone. But I think that there is room in terms of allowing parliamentarians more free votes, allowing more parliamentarians also to bring forth private members' bills, and allowing those bills to actually be voted upon instead of going through this whole process of a lottery and then, we gave our accord and that's it, right? I think a smart government should be tapping into the talent that's available on all sides of the House of Commons and the expertise that's there to allow for the real free speech, which is what Parliament should stand for, right? The Parliament should be open Parliament, where everybody feels that they're valued and that their opinions and knowledge is valued. And that's what I find lacking now, that you feel you have to control the message, whereas in fact, you don't allow your own team to actually develop the type of legislation. And Frank has worked on that. Actually, Frank, you should be talking about this, because you actually had some points that you've raised, and I think they're important points when you were in Parliament. But this fear, this fear of not allowing people who have been duly elected through free elections to have some input into making legislation better is frightening. It's frightening, honestly.
Okay, on that note, David, again, I ask you for a reflection of Canadians' viewpoints on centralization, as Guy's talked about happening in Canada, obviously happening elsewhere in the world. What are the Canadians' views or concerns on that front?
Well, it's really it's a hard one, right? Because on the one hand, we've asked, and others we've seen surveys globally that when people are asked, what would you rather have, democracy or the things you want? And more people choose the things they want. If the ends justify the means, I'm willing to, see an erosion of democracy. And it's not to say that the people don't want democracy. It's that they're willing to allow for sort of more autocratic, centralized governments. I mean, just to bring it full circle, Frank, back to our original conversation of polarization. When we look around the world, the United States, Turkey, India, Brazil, Hungary, Philippines, there's a common thread that all of those countries, and Canada, not quite there, I don't think, but they're high, or France, most recently,
Yes.
highly polarized countries, right? And what's driving that polarization? Well, high levels of inequality and them versus us mentality. And so if you are on Team Trump, you're willing to let Trump do what he needs to do to keep in power because you'd rather him destroy democracy than to let the Democrats win, right? And that's basically what's happened in all of those countries, where in India, it's much more based on religion and nationalism. In Brazil, it's very class-based, but in all cases, it's an identity being pitted against another identity. And so polarization is what's allowing for this centralization or authoritarianism to be justified and be accepted, even if in a survey, most Americans would say democracy is at the core of what it means to be the United States. But Republicans will look at the 2020 election and say that was undemocratic because they thought it was stolen. And Democrats will say, oh, that's democracy, we won. And that's a dangerous place where people don't accept the outcomes and trust that the system will produce a fair outcome.
And I think there's also a weakness of the international, if we're talking international organizations, in terms of being able to actually fulfill their role. When you have a veto on the Security Council of the UN, you're not going to move forward. Okay, we've seen that now with Russia and with the war in the Ukraine. So I think that these institutions have to be rethought also in terms of what is their role and how much they can actually be involved in terms of resolving certain conflicts that are taking place, because certainly there's a total failure, in my opinion, of both NATO. It could be because we're not financing them well. It could be because of other issues. Oh my gosh, time is up. Andrew.
Does anybody want to finish that line of conversation before I jump in?
I would have finished only by saying, yes, see a silver lining, and that would be with education. I mean, I've seen something on the news saying that people who were regular watchers of Fox News, when they were subjected to CNN for a month, tended to actually have a more balanced way of seeing the world. And prior to working with Karen Mock at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, I used to work also in an organization called Media Awareness Network, which was an organization, it has a different name now, but does the same thing, which wanted to bring a critical view of the media in schools, so that not to tell them what's good and what's good and what's bad, what's wrong and what's right, but just to tell them how to give them the tools to be able to analyze what they see, what they hear, either on the internet or in the media. And that's been sorely lacking, but these organizations still exist. So it belongs to governments, provincially and federally, to actually increase the importance of literacy. I know that we've been concerned with financial literacy, but media literacy, internet or IT literacy is actually important, and we need to realize that and implement that in at school, so that we'll see that thinking critically is a way different thing than what we are seeing being portrayed these days.
Okay, what I'll do, Frank, if you don't mind, I'll go through a number of questions, and what I'll do is just direct each question to one person, if you don't mind, and I'll ask you to be brief too. So I'll start with David Coletto. There was a recent article in the National Post entitled "The Working Classes Are a Volcano Waiting to Erupt." Do you share that concern?
I do, and I think we were talking about Pierre Poilievre as an example earlier. I think he's seen the potential volcano and is trying to realign the Conservative coalition, as Marie Le Pen tried to do in France, as Boris Johnson effectively did around Brexit in the United Kingdom, which is to tap into both an economic and cultural anxiety about the future, and as we discussed, point out the villain and try to rally those troops. I mean, I did some as pollsters say, segmentation, or we were trying to understand different groupings of Canadians, and you know, the majority of the country I would describe as anxious. Some are on the left, some are on the right. But what the fundamental difference is between probably most people in Ottawa and most people in the media and most people on Bay Street, for example, is general optimism about the future, right? So when the Prime Minister or the Minister of Industry or the Minister of the Environment's out there talking about climate, for example, and our transition that we need, they talk a lot about how we're going to have all these green jobs and we're going to be the leaders globally. But for a lot of Canadians, particularly those in more traditional, I hate the term, blue collar, labor, skilled labor jobs, that sounds like a scary future to them. And so there's this mismatch between what our leaders are saying the future looks like and what people actually believe. And so if we're not bringing them along, I do think, Andrew, that volcano could erupt, and the result would be pretty unpredictable, and perhaps the election of somebody you would think would be completely opposite of their interests in office.
Yeah. Any backup panelists, I'll ask you this question. Speaking about the polarization in the House of Commons, do you have any views on whether electoral reform, such as proportional representation, might improve this?
It depends what, when we talk about electoral reform, and it's been discussed in the House, and it was even discussed in my time, it's being discussed in provincial legislatures also. I think you have to be more precise. What type of reform is it exactly? Do we want a full proportional representation system? Will that cure the polarization? I'm not sure it will cure the polarization, because then we're going to have, and again, it may be a good thing. We may have more people with other values and principles being elected under a pure proportional representation system than we have at the present time. Does our system need to be reformed? I think most people would agree that we do need to introduce certain measures, as I talked about earlier, in terms of making Parliament more relevant and closer to the people. It's not a cure-all, is what I'm going to say, Andrew. It's not a cure-all for what's happening, because there are countries in the world, if we take it on the international level, which do have those systems, but they're not doing any better than we are doing in terms of the conflict that exists within their parliaments.
If I can, Andrew, if I can add a bit of different perspective here, I think when we're talking about polarization and centralization, it can actually be stopped, or at least slowed, by the ability of parties to talk to each other, right? And the problem we're seeing in Canada, like in provinces, is that search for absolute majority, which means that you're basically going to be a king or a queen for 4 years if you don't care about what the opposition has to say, which is what we are seeing right now. So if we have a system that fosters, that encourages, that helps majority governments, and I'm talking about absolute majority governments, then it's actually helping polarization, because you want to actually be the absolute king, absolute monarch afterwards, be able to do whatever you want, and you don't need to speak to anyone afterwards. So if you want to slow down polarization or even reverse it, you need to have a system, and I don't have the perfect system in mind, but you need at least a system that will help and give an incentive for parties and different opinions to speak to each other.
Can I just add, Andrew? Minority governments, the people spoke, by the way. Yeah. People spoke. We have minority governments.
I think we're going to have Frank say.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit. I'll just add a little bit to that too, because I did a lot of work looking at these issues and how to correct them. I think that we don't want to put the cart ahead of the horse, and people are looking for a solution. And I think the first solution is you can have more people that are disempowered, as we were all members of Parliament, and can feel the weight of our leaderships, either the Prime Minister's office or the opposition's office, really bearing down. And we talked about how they're even now pushing into committees, where they're not even letting us make decisions in committees, and everything that Guy touched on and Eleni is correct. So I think before we even look at going out into the world and fixing it, we need to fix it within the confines of Parliament. We need to get back to how the system was designed, where members of Parliament do matter. As Guy said, one of our prime ministers said they don't matter. He's brought us along that path, but we need to go back to where they do matter. And then from there, we can start to look outside of it. But I think if we start to try and reform it before we fix ourselves, we're just going to be adding to the problem.
If I can just do a quick advertisement on Pearson. So this is the 125th birthday year of Lester B. Pearson. And one of the points we were just making in a webinar last week was that he did a lot of things in those 5 years of minority government. And what's remarkable is that 50 years, all those things are still in place or have been advanced upon. Whereas what you see now is each government comes in and spends the first year undoing what the previous government did. Mayor Caron, I have a question for you. Speaking about polarization, how do local politics compare to federal politics?
That's a good question. And it depends on the city. It depends on the size of the city, because Rimouski is 50,000. We don't have political parties, which is a breath of fresh air. Like, I really enjoy being elected as an independent and having 11 councillors who have been elected as independents. You can talk to each other. It's really fun. We have private agendas, like we're there for a reason, but we can share. We can trade insights, and we each bring our level of expertise. I find that experience absolutely fascinating and really enjoyable. Now, it might be different for a larger city, Montreal, Toronto, any city, I would say over 100,000 people is facing challenges, and most of them, you have political parties. You have the same logic, once again, of trying to get elected, trying to minimize the opposition. And say the larger the city is, the larger the system is, the easier it is to work through the politics of demonizing the enemy, creating villains, creating scapegoats. Here in Rimouski, I haven't seen that, and I haven't seen that in small cities of, say, 20 to 100,000, because you're focused really on helping people around you do better, because you know them, because you walk alongside them. They're your neighbors, so you have that personal connection that really helps bringing back politics to its essence of wanting to work for the common good in the community.
You know, there's still a bunch of questions coming in, so I'm going to change plan for a minute. I'm just going to tell the audience about a couple of webinars coming up, and then have each of you take a minute and pick whatever topic you want to comment on. One of the ones that has come in a lot of questions about social media and whether we can do more to control that, but feel free to comment on anything. I'll just tell the audience that we've got 3 more webinars during this conference. Tomorrow we've got a session with the Honorable Margaret McCain, who'll be talking about early childhood education and childcare. And we have a session with the Labour Minister, Seamus O'Regan, talking about a number of issues around labor and the future of work. And on Friday, we've got a session on new growth sectors that will look at new and innovative sectors that will need to be part of economic recovery. So over to you. Maybe I'll just direct the traffic. So Eleni Bekopanos, first to you with 30 to 45 seconds.
Well, I think I've said about social media. I think we need more controls in terms of the social media platforms, and that's not to take away freedom of speech. I truly believe in freedom of speech. It leads to debate, but I gave the example of actually verifying who that person is and what country they're actually from would be a good first step in terms of making sure that this information is not coming from, I don't want to call them enemies, but from another country that's trying to interfere in terms of our parliamentary democracy. And our parliamentary democracy, I have to say it on a positive note, is still very strong when you compare us to a number of countries all over the world. We've managed to not go down the road that the Americans have gone in terms of polarization. Okay. So I'll stop there, Andrew.
Thank you, Eleni. Guy Caron.
I'll just say that we have quite a challenge in our hands as progressives, and I'm looking at the acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk, and we see the fears that this raises on the real freedom of speech that will be, and I'm seeing lots of progressives wanting to just remove themselves and saying, this is not my place anymore. I want to boycott Twitter. I don't want anything to do with it. And that's the worst reaction, because we're giving a full platform to a single set of ideas that will take over the way that Trump is trying to create his own social media. If we are, like, Twitter as the strength of unifying around ideas, and not a single one, but many ideas. Yes, there are excesses. There is anonymity that brings the worst in some people, but there is the ability of talking to each other and confronting different views in a way that says better than Facebook is, because the algorithm is not necessarily isolating you from other ideas the way Facebook has been doing. So I do think that we should stop having the reflex of this is not for me because it's owned by someone like Elon Musk. I'm not going to put any qualifications on him, qualifiers on him. But we have to keep in this place and keep fighting. We cannot leave these grounds to the right and to those who want to use it for their own purposes.
Thank you, Guy. David Coletto.
Maybe I'll just end on an optimistic note, because we've been talking about the sort of the decline of democracy and its threats. And, at least at the federal level, I'm at least encouraged that, headed into the early 2000s, we saw a sharp decline in voter turnout. And that's only one thing that voters, that citizens should do, but it's a good indicator of how relevant, I think, our institutions are, and particularly our democratic institutions. And we saw a rebound. We saw young people coming out and voting in larger numbers. We saw it, and we saw it sustained. And so for me, it's yes, there's lots of threats. There's always been threats on democracy. I didn't live during the Cold War, but that was the ultimate battle between liberal democracy and communism and authoritarianism. And that's going to continue to be the case. So my hope is, as horrible as the war in Ukraine is, it reminds us that we can't be complacent. And this is an opportunity for folks like Mr. Caron and Ms. Bacopanos and Mr. Bayless, who served in our legislatures, that the responsibility is actually on our leaders. It's not on our citizens. That if we expect people to act like adults and be respectful, we should do that in our national institutions as well. So that's my hope. It's very hopeful. But I think that's what we need to do, and we need to ensure that the institutions are there to encourage that kind of behavior.
Thank you, David, and over to you, Frank Bayless, for the final comment and closing us out.
So I'll make a quick comment on a touch on our democracies and both the strengths and the weaknesses of social media and that. And we saw social media do a lot of great things. The Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matters, where people have taken into their hands and made real changes, political changes that are pushing themselves through the systems. And we've seen the abuses too. We've seen the political manipulation. And another one of our studies when I was in government was on how the Russian government was manipulating the Brexit vote and the elections in the United States. So both are there. I believe that the younger people are more technically savvy, and they're going to be brought up to learn you don't trust everything you read. And so I think with time, those social media platforms will be more able to do good than to be manipulated to do bad. That's my optimistic hope. And I also am aware that at least we're talking about these issues about our democracies being attacked. And in so doing, it is my hope that we sensitize people to them. And as Guy touched on, and so did Eleni and David, that we need to protect these institutions, solidify them, strengthen them, and protect them. And I think there's a lot of work we can do on that front. So I'm looking forward to seeing that work happen.
Great. Thank you all. You know what? We can't hear the people applauding for you. So what I'm going to do is ask you to thank each other as we tune out. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Merci.